Not so much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not so much of the heavy thank you, because I wanted to say what a shame about that speech, Mr. Speaker. I was talking actually about John Key, but I also have to include the former Speaker in that, because I mean that was a real shame. It was really, really shameful, actually. John Key and the National Government have talked it up, and my goodness, is it being put down. The commentators have dissed it, and so will New Zealand. So John Key has failed his big Tuesday test. Now, we in Labour aren't surprised at that. You see, it's one thing to come up with rhetoric and slogans during an election campaign and to parade up and down the country with a nice smile on your face, but it's quite another to find real answers. It takes real talent and intelligence to come up with step change, as John Key likes to call it. But John Key's just proven to the country, Mr. Speaker, that he hasn't got it. Today we heard a mediocre speech from a mediocre Prime Minister and a mediocre government. Worse than average, a fail for National, a fail under the national standards that are pushing through, actually a D-. But I do want to go back to saying that it's a shame about that speech. Because it's a real shame, Mr. Speaker, for the people who believe that the National Government would actually stop their kids going off to Australia. Now, what did we see in the paper yesterday? Skills shortage in Australia, unemployment at 5.5, 30% lower than New Zealand, looking for skilled workers. It's a shame about the people who believe that the National Government would be able to do something about catching up with Australia's pay rates. Well, we all know that that's rubbish, because it's a shame about the $500,000 that we've wasted on the Don Brash manifesto that was in the rubbish bin almost before it was published. But then, Mr. Speaker, it's a shame for those workers who've lost their jobs in the last year. I feel it's a real shameful for the workers whose hours have been cut and who've been fighting pay freezes, and there's more to come. It's a particular shame for those workers on minimum wage who will receive a paltry, a miserly 25 cents an hour increase from the 1st of April, including the cleaners, Mr. Speaker, who work in this Parliament, who from the 1st of April will be paid $12.75 an hour. And it's a shame for all of those who've been laid off through no fault of their own, with no redundancy pay and no compensation, no answers to that. And I feel it's particularly shameful for those 2,500 workers who lined up for just 150 minimum wage jobs in South Auckland a couple of weeks ago. But also, what's a real shame is the underclass that John Key made much of in his speech a couple of years ago before he became the Prime Minister. Actually, Mr. Speaker, it took 17 pages into his speech for him to mention the underclass at all. Well, I guess that's better than nothing, because as far as I can see, I don't think he's mentioned the underclass, or the so-called underclass, since his speech in 2007, or at least since he paraded young Aroha at Waitangi. And we've all seen in the last week what they think about the way that they've been used. And I can't find one word in John Key's statement today that describes a single idea about how to go about making change, real change, change for the better and change for the many, not the few. Instead, what we've seen is a speech that promises more review groups, task forces, advisory groups, discussion documents, action plans, and even a working group of experts. What's that? What's that? That's a new one, isn't it? That's a new one. I haven't heard that one before. A working group of experts. More bureaucrats. More people being paid $500,000 like Don Brash to come up with something that will go in the rubbish bin. And, Mr. Speaker, the other shame is that John Key seems to be pretending that the steep rise in unemployment that was revealed last week doesn't exist. He must be pretending, because otherwise surely today's speech would have come up with a plan to do something about the nation's unemployed, to help those who are out of work or whose jobs are at risk, and they are still at risk. There are jobs on the line as we speak today. A real Prime Minister who cared about these things would have talked about how we're going to address the skills and the jobs that we need for the future? And how are we going to help current and future workers achieve the skills to get them into work? He would have talked about things like the ACE funding cuts that are going on right now as we speak, where workers who are unemployed are unable to access any help with literacy and numeracy. But isn't this supposed to be the big push of this government? He would have had a plan to give hope to those who are struggling, both those in work and looking for work. Now, my attention inevitably turned to one particularly mean little phrase in the speech, and I quote on page 10, "The government will continue to look at whether labour laws are imposing excessive costs on the country and holding back opportunities to create jobs." Now that sounds like Don Brash. You know, Don Brash managed to sneak one little sentence into the speech. Now I ask, what's the point of hitting workers? Is this a crumb to please his right-wing supporters, the Prime Minister's and national government's right-wing supporters, at the expense of those without economic or bargaining power? Because we should not fool ourselves, Mr Speaker, that we're going to get closer to Australia by attacking workers' pay and condition. Labour laws did not cause a recession, and they're not going to hold back any recovery. But there it is in the speech, nasty little mean stuff about getting into holiday pay, cutting back stuff, getting into personal grievances, and oh yes, you know. So here we have today laid bare National's brighter future. Unfortunately, it's an empty vessel. Now, I want to make it clear, Mr Speaker, that Labour will not and cannot support an increase in GST. Labour will not and cannot support it because this government believes that in order to give our richest... Oh, that got them going, Don't like that, do you? Don't like that. We believe that in order to give our richest earners a tax cuts, we don't believe that the rest of New Zealand should pay for it. So let's talk about who the rest of New Zealand are. The rest of New Zealand, Mr Speaker, includes a single parent on $45,000 a year who works in the public service. Now, we know the national government hates the public service. They're on and on. I have to say, when the previous speaker was on talking about, you know, the police and so on, where were they out the front today when the corrections staff were out there protesting about this government's plans to privatise their jobs? Where were the members from there? Not to be seen. And all of those people in the public service, they won't be getting a pay increase this year, didn't get one last year, not even one to match inflation. And they're going to face increase in the cost of living, increase in the cost of ACC. That's a 3% pay cut. And the rest of New Zealand, Mr Speaker, includes workers whose families are living off the minimum wage, soon to be $12.75 an hour, and support through working families. They're facing increased pressure from this government to even survive. Now, I didn't hear anything in the speech today about a plan for them. Now, Mr Speaker, what I want to say is that New Zealand has a wage problem, not a tax problem. We have a wage problem, and, you know, we were delighted. I remember when I came into Parliament in 2005, we were delighted that members of the opposition were saying we needed to catch up with Australia. We needed to increase wages. We agree with that, Labour agrees with that, but we need economic activity that creates jobs, and a lot more than the pathetic jobs summit that we've seen. So, you know, Mr Speaker, there's so many things that could have been said in a speech that weren't. Where are the job-rich programs? Where are the green jobs development? Where are the programs for skills development and apprenticeships? Where is the support for those who've lost their jobs to upskill? Where's the support for research and development? Where is the support to really take our country forward? But instead, what we got from our Prime Minister today is that we're going to have 15% GST for all low-paid workers, low-income people. No, not a $15 minimum wage, as it should have been, a paltry 25 cents an hour, but a 15% GST, 15% GST, 25 cents an hour for the minimum wage. So I have a feeling that the people of New Zealand will have a lot to say about this. I know they're going to have an awful lot to say in Auckland about local government reform. So, Mr Speaker, shame about the speech. Shame.